I worked for Brief as an educator and a kind of doing some research. And then when I left Brief, I joined the Bahamas National Trust, and they haven't let me go since. So I've worked in various capacities or in different roles at the BNT over the last almost 7 years. And those include, I've managed the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve. I've just switched roles. I managed New Providence Parks. As recently as Monday, I've switched into a new role called Operations Manager. And so I'm really focused more on how does the organization get its work done? How do we best achieve mission? And so thinking about processes, supporting all of the departments, so kind of a more higher level and integrated level of work. And it's really exciting to me because I'm kind of a person that wants to get stuff done. And I always wondered why I couldn't focus on any one aspect of science, because I thought I needed to be a scientist. But I am a scientist, but I am more than a scientist. I am very, very committed to conservation in the Bahamas. And I think that national parks and protected areas are one of the most effective ways to achieve conservation and protect the Bahamas and make us more sustainable overall. So that's a little bit about my background, a little bit about why I do what I do and how I do it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nikita Shiel-Roll. Many of you may know me from my work with Young Marine Explorers and the Cat Island Conservation Institute. Professionally, I am a marine conservation biologist, but now I find myself really working at the intersection between community and nature. And in the past year, because of Hurricane Dorian, I've really expanded beyond just my work in the marine realm, and I'm working a lot more in many different areas as it relates to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And all of my work is really framed under the umbrella of climate justice, really looking at the heart of and the core root of the challenges that we're faced with right now. And a lot of that is because of the very complex history that we have evolved from. And so now what's been really fun, also because of COVID, it's really allowed me to birth a project that I have been working on for a while, a conservation wellness company called Cat Island Mermaid. You may have seen some of the Mermaid TV episodes, but this is really my telling the story of Queen Mermaid, who ruled the ocean queendom. And because Mama Earth was crying and in pain, she decided that she was going to shapeshift into a human and was born as Nikita. And then Nikita spent 33 years traveling the world and studying the oceans, and then realized that she had ocean magic. And with her ocean magic, she was here to heal the world. And so the Mermaid TV episodes are all about Eagle Ray Empress on her mission to heal the world. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Miller. I am a science communicator. So that's currently my role right now. I live in Canada, in Ontario, and I came here for school and did marine and freshwater bio. I went on to do some graduate work as well, and then realized that as much as I like science and I like studying science, I like talking about science, I don't really want to do the experiments. So I transitioned from doing the research to kind of communicating that work. And it still gives me the opportunity to continue lifelong learning and studying science to a certain degree, but it's more about sharing it, making it accessible, making it engaging for people. So right now I'm working at a museum nearby, so a museum in Kitchener, and I'm the family experience manager. So I'm in charge of developing our children and family programming. It's sort of a bit of a range of topics, but I do sort of focus on the science side of things and try to integrate that into my programming. And I think for me, one of the areas of interest that I've been diving into and doing my own sort of learning with is the idea of STEAM, which is some of you may be familiar with the acronym STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. STEAM adds another element of arts and humanities. And the idea behind going from STEM to STEAM is that a lot of societies or our world's problems can't just be addressed by coming at it from a purely technological or mathematical or even scientific perspective, that there does need to be that arts and humanities component that takes into consideration how people experience things and personal experiences, and sort of, applies a greater context to what is somewhat inert. Sometimes when we think about science, we don't always we think of it more like a textbook style thing or just pure facts, and arts and humanities can add an element of accessibility and relevance to people. So that's an area of interest that I'm kind of diving into. A lot of my sustainability and conservation sort of work has been mostly on a volunteer basis. So I've volunteered with different organizations. I've volunteered with Nikita. There's another organization near me that I've also worked with for some time or volunteered with for some time. So it's an area that I'm really excited about and passionate about. It's just something that I end up I try to focus my volunteer time towards contributing to that. So that's kind of my background, is science communication, doing some STEAM stuff, and a lot of trying to help people understand science concepts.
Tamika, do you want to jump in here and tell us about yourself? No, not hearing you. Okay. Let me know in the chat when you're ready, and while you sort up tech stuff. I'm going to ask Fallon, Nikita, and Ashley. Oh, are you there, Nikita? Tamika?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Lovely.
Hi.
Hello.
Ashley, thank you for that STEAM injection. I'm so very excited. So I think I may be the other voice on this panel that is not scientific. I am a documentarian and multidisciplinary artist, and I'm sorry I don't have a photo up. I really tried on my mobile and it said there was a photo there, and I don't know what's happening on the desktop, so bear with me. My work is all about preserving Bahamian culture in a time of climate crisis. So while I'm not a scientist, I do the culture work in what I will loosely define as documenting as much of a Bahamian experience as I can while we are still here. It is very important to me to not, so many people run towards the disaster. My goal is to get there before the quote unquote disaster happens. It's my job. I've tasked myself with recording all the things that I love about our culture while we still have the opportunity to do so.
Awesome. Thanks to all of you for those great introductions. And I think we can already see the diversity in the panel. I guess my first question is always around definitions. So I know we're going to be throwing some terms around. Can y'all help us to break some of them down? Because I think there are a lot of buzzwords that we use, but we don't necessarily know 100% what they mean. So can we get some definitions for climate change, climate resilience, environment, any other terms that you think that you use a lot of, or that come up a lot in your work that you want to define for us?
I'll start with just kind of piggybacking off of what Tamika, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Okay, Tamika, I think that we should start with a definition of science, especially because I think from listening to all of you give your introductions that my view of science is very all-encompassing. And to me, I think there is a huge misconception about what science is, how it is carried out, and what it tells us, right? So science is not a linear process. There's no universal method. Science is a circular, ongoing process by which humans, it is a human process by which we try to understand the world, the natural world. So we look for things like patterns, and we have a very, a methodical way of looking through what we see around us. And we share our observations, our ideas, and then we allow, by putting that out into the public, allow people to respond and basically vet that information in a very structured way. So there's a peer review process, and it's very much human. So it is always happening within the context of humans that are carrying it out. And so for that reason, it's flawed. There are some good science and there's some bad science, right? But there are universal ways that we can evaluate scientific information and what is science and what is not. And we can help use that understanding of science to make better decisions, to better be more critical in our thinking. So what do we think about when we think of science? We think of information that is public. It has to be accessible to people. It has to be available out there for people to say, okay, can I replicate this idea, this study, and find similar results? It has to be testable. It has to be something that you could say, okay, we can actually test that, and not in a lab, but something that you can say, okay, if you expect that climate change is happening, you would see these trends happening, and then you would start collecting data to test whether or not that's the case. And then all you need is several observations to say, okay, we need to challenge this, right? And that's what's happening. It's a conversation that's ongoing, and it has to be replicable. So just seeing something one time does not make an observation a fact, right? And there are different degrees of confidence of information. And when we use the word theory, we are talking about something in science that is very, 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 very well understood and explains so much that it's unlikely that that information will change dramatically. We can talk about examples, but I think that science, people think about information being handed down to them in a book or in coming down from the sky. But science is a human process. And if we understand that, we can appreciate that there are challenges, that it won't give us ultimate truth. It gives us a good decision-making tool, but I agree with everyone that we have to bring in components that reflect how do we use that information? And it has to be within the context because it's a tool. Science is one of the many tools that we have. So I just think that's an important context for when we talk about anything related to science.
I think that's really interesting, Fallon. Thank you for setting the stage there. For me, science is really the lens in which I view the world. And it allows me, what's been really interesting this time during COVID-19, where so much is happening, there's so much uncertainty, and the world is really seeing the scientific method in real time, where like most people don't see that. Usually the science happens in the lab or in the field, and then you see kind of the finished, polished picture. But what's happened, because there's just been so many deaths and COVID-19 has become a real crisis, the society has been exposed to aspects of the scientific method and the great uncertainty that exists in science. And I think this has led to a lot of confusion and a lot of mistrust from the general public, because people don't fully understand the scientific method. To your question, Alicia, about some of the jargon that we use in science to talk about climate change and where we are right now, I'm really practicing the art of code switching, or really becoming aware that depending on whom I'm speaking with, I'm going to have to use a different vernacular. And that when I'm working with colleagues at the UN, you know, I may use the word resilience because they love their buzzwords, right? But if I'm speaking with people in my community in Cat Island, I'm speaking more about how do we ensure that we can survive the next hurricane that comes? How can we make sure that we are prepared as we lose our access to water, because we're already living in a very water scarce country? You know, how do we ensure that we are as prepared as possible for the rapid changes that are taking place in society right now? And this is where I think the work of Ashley is so important, is in the science communication. And as scientists, I think it's really important for us to be intentional about the words that we use, how we use them, and when we use them, because there can be so much uncertainty. And it's very easy, especially for those of us who are very specialized in the subject, to make assumptions and assume that everyone has the same level of understanding that we do, which is not the case.
So I think I'll jump in with, I guess we'll kind of segue into some more definitions, but I realized that like we started out by talking about climate change, and we probably should define climate. So I think one of the areas where people tend to struggle with, well, what's climate change? Is cold today? You know, is that you're right, it is cold today, but that's today. And so making sure that people are clear about what is the difference between weather and climate. So weather is kind of our day-to-day, smaller scale, week to week changes. And I live in Canada, so winter still happens. It's been a little milder, but you know, a lot of people, and particularly in some of the colder parts, are saying, well, you know, it's freezing, it's negative whatever, and there's wind chill, so climate change is nonsense. And so for people to understand that like weather patterns are still going to keep progressing and ticking along to a certain degree, you're still going to have your seasonal changes, and there will be days when it's cold, but climate is more of this longer term, longer scale that we're looking at, a longer time scale. So when we think of weather, we're thinking of day to day, week to week, month to month, but climate is a much longer time scale. And when people are, in particular, if we tie that back into the idea of climate change, what scientists are seeing, and what other communities are seeing. So some Indigenous communities who are noticing that there are changes happening in their environment, they're noticing that over these longer periods of time, these multiple years, these decades, that there are changes happening, that the weather is getting warmer. Or I'm thinking of a specific example with someone I know who works with some communities in the far north. He's been doing some work with them to learn about how has that affected their ability to use sea ice if they're hunting, if the climate is, and these are people who've lived on the land for a very long time. So you can get science information. I think there is now a push to get climate data from other communities to help us go further back in places where we aren't able to take those measurements. But I guess just like as a framing question, when we talk about weather, we're talking about day-to-day experiences, but climate is if you take a snapshot over many, many years, we're able to notice these changes. And climate change then is essentially that we're seeing over the last few decades that the global climate average temperatures, the temperatures around the world have been slowly ticking up. And I say slowly, but slow to the point where we're not noticing it super fast. But if we compare it to like how the world changes in like a geological time scale, this is actually really rapid. So that's the part that's really concerning for a lot of scientists, is that this is a very rapid change that's happening on geological time scales, but because we live day to day, it seems like it's taking a long time. So it's kind of like, I guess, a bit of an intro to weather versus climate and what is climate change.
So I'll add into one of the simple ways too to think about climate is that you have different regions of the earth. And so it's closer to the equator, you tend to have more warm climates, more tropical climates. But even in areas that are right around the center of the earth, you can have high elevation. And then because your air is cooler at higher elevations, at that location, the climate at the top of that mountain stays relatively, either there's ice there all the time. So it's more about a place and where, what is that average weather? And when we talk about climate change, the thing that's driving climate on shorter time scales is the spherical shape in the earth, right? So some parts of the earth are receiving more energy from the sun, more heat. And so that's why you see the range in temperature and climate across the globe from the north to the south. And then you have changes because you're moving around the sun and the tilt of the earth, and it's complicated, right? But what's really important to note about climate change is that people will say often, oh, well, we've had climate cycles before. And yes, we have over the last, I think, correct me, but I think over the last 650,000 years, for example, we've had 7 periods of time where climate you've had more warm periods and then colder periods, warmer periods and colder periods. And what does that look like? And it is important for the Bahamas because as the world warms, on average, the whole world is warming, you have ice that is trapped on land, which is what we call glaciers. So what happens when you get warmer? Ice melts, you have more water coming off land that wasn't in the ocean. It causes your ocean to expand. There's a lot more going on, but this is important because sea levels change with these glacial, what we call glacial cycles. What is really, really important, and Ashley, I think we need to be very clear when we say this, the change that we are seeing now is incredibly rapid on these scales. It's faster than we have ever been able to record. So if you look at a graph of cycles doing this over 800,000 years, we're talking in less than 100 years or hundreds of years, you now have your graph going like this, okay? So we are talking about unprecedented rates of change that we have not seen before. And for low-lying countries like the Bahamas, a little bit of sea level change can make a huge difference because most of our land is less than 3 meters above sea level. So small changes in sea level change the amount of water, the amount of land that you have in the Bahamas. And we are a coastal nation. All of our assets and resources are along the coast. So that's really important to understand those cycles. And it is not even remotely short. It is incredibly fast on the time scale that we're talking about. I can continue, but does anyone else want to chime in? And that has to do with we could talk a little bit about the drivers of climate change too. Greenhouse gases, right? CO2, methane, these gases that are invisible, but in the atmosphere, right? They trap heat. And the connection to the humans and why this is something that we have to address is that we know it is well demonstrated. It is not a debate anymore. There's been extensive research that increases in these greenhouse gases are driving these rates of warming, and they are unprecedented. And humans, our activities, whether it's agriculture, transportation, all of these sectors that we burn fossil fuels and add more carbon into the atmosphere that was stored either in, when we call them fossil fuels, because they are literally the remains of ancient life that was buried under the rock that we are pumping out of the earth. So we know that our actions are connected to climate change. And that's why this is a human issue that we have to address.
I'd like to chime in. I'm Marjan. I actually, officially today, I am a master's in research in climate and atmospheric science. When we talk about climate change being a human issue, I'm careful to say that only because the reason we have a lot of climate change and greenhouse gases, all of that is completely entirely true. But once you connect it to the actual activity in the first world versus third world environments, it doesn't entirely add up. When we talk about environmentalism, we talk about sustainability, it's mainly, for example, in the US, once we started talking about pollution, there was pollution happening inside the 1850s. There was smog that was causing air pollution inside in England. That was a huge problem for a lot of people, huge issues with air quality. The Industrial Revolution happened in 1850. At the same time, 1850, you're just having people who are being freed from slavery. You're having folks who don't have that level of industrial revolution happening in certain places, steam engines, things are happening. More people are moving across the pond to the US. In the 1970s, there are folks in the Sierra Club in the US who are saying, this is all of our issue. We have to save the planet. We have to do X, Y, and Z. But they're mostly white groups pushing these ideas forward. Now, if you keep in mind, third world people in third world nations who build iPhones and things like that, that help us continue forward in the first world, it's not necessarily the blame on them. It is a lot of blame on the first world. And the reason I mention that is because I've been in situations where a British person would say to me, you folks in the third world are at fault for climate change because you will not change what you're doing the same way we're doing it. And you have to keep in mind when we talk about climate change and resilience and all this and that, it's a lot harder for developing nations to do the same things that developed nations are doing because they've had more time. They've made more of an effect on the world. And you see it in China now, where you have folks in the US blame China for a lot of smog as they develop and such and things like that. On the side, like compared to India, where they are working for clean energy while developing, right? So again, I'm very iffy when I say it is a human issue, but you can't put the blame on all humans.
Nikita, I know you don't say, but I definitely have a response too.
So I think this is where the climate justice comes in, right? And the heart of this is social justice and really diving into equity. And absolutely, I mean, it's both ed. It's a human issue, right? Humans are the ones who are responsible for the change in climate. And different humans have greater responsibility. And so as much as if every single Bahamian, like we all went solar and we like were growing all our food and we were just sort of like the vision of sustainability, I think we should work towards doing that. And I think that's awesome. And also it's not going to change the reality that we're in because what we're contributing as even the Caribbean is next to nothing compared to the two main countries, the United States and China. And this is where, this is really where it starts to shift into capitalism, when it starts to shift into these major corporations, and the heart of it is greed. And so this, and I know once you start talking about greed, for some people it becomes a bit wishy-washy, and I think people are a little bit more uncomfortable having these deeper conversations about equity, because now what we're talking about, the conversation shifts to responsibility. And where we are challenged right now, specifically as a Caribbean, and I'm going to speak to us as a Caribbean because we have to be acting and thinking as a region, because we're going to be the first to go, but then everyone else is going to go there after us. And so if there's any chance for us to survive, we have to be working strategically together. And just to put things in perspective, I believe right now we are on the mark to hit the mark of 4 degrees temperature rise. We will not exist. The Bahamas, like, whoop, bye, we're gonna be gone, all right? We have to, and the world has to limit global temperature rise. Yes.
Can you explain like the temperature, like, you know, we've been talking about like something to stay alive under
1.5, yeah, so that's where I was going.
Yeah. Can you explain like what that means, that 4%?
So where I think Fallon sort of touched on it a bit. We are all using, whether it's fossil fuels or the plastic, all the things that we're consuming, that is releasing greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. The biggest greenhouse gas that is a concern for us is carbon dioxide. You've probably heard about it. And the thing is, carbon dioxide is natural. There's supposed to be carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The problem is that there is too much. And so things like trees and the ocean are what we call carbon sinks, where they take on carbon dioxide. what we're seeing happen now is that because the levels of carbon dioxide are growing so rapidly, so when Fallon was talking about the graph and she went all the way up, that's because the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is just massive. And this is creating warming. So when the sun, the heat rays come into our planet, they're supposed to, some of it's going to be absorbed, but it's supposed to bounce off our planet and then leave. But because there's so much greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, it creates a blanket. Some people kind of refer to it as the greenhouse effect, but it traps the heat energy in within our atmosphere, which then results in the warming of the planet, which then leads to the melting of the sea caps or the glaciers that Fallon mentioned. And this is where the problem really lies. And for small islands or like us in the Bahamas, as the sea level begins to rise, and so the sea level rises for two reasons. One, we talked about the ice melting that's on land that will then make its way to the ocean. But also, if you've ever boiled a pot of water, you know, when you start to boil that water, it starts to bubble because it expands. And so the hot water in the ocean starts to expand. You know, the atoms want more space. And this also contributes to sea level rise. And so what we're experiencing is that when we say we need 1.5 to stay alive, this means that as a globe, as a world, we have to reduce our rising temperatures and predictions of the rising temperatures so that it is no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius. I think what's really important to note, right now, the world is on track for a 4 degrees temperature rise, which means there's not going to be a Bahamas. Which
By
means,
when again, Nikita? By when?
Well, for sure by the end of the century, but for us in the Bahamas, we're looking, I mean, 10 to 20 years, we're going to start seeing some real impacts if like things.
Somewhere around 10 to 12% of our land mass being lost over the next 50 to, I mean, it depends on where you're looking, but I mean, it's bad. And if I could just chime in for a second, Nikita, it definitely is not about assigning blame at all. And especially for the Bahamas, I think that we need to think about the fact that exactly what Nikita said, we could become carbon neutral. We could not be doing anything, and that still will not change if these other these countries that are the big emitters don't make the change. And so where does that leave us, right? And I think that's where the term resilience, we could start talking about resilience, is how do we, knowing that the fate is not exactly in our hands. Now, we do have a role to play in terms of advocating for ourselves and the region. And I know Nikita has a lot to say about that, and everyone else. And I think if I have seen some of Tamika's work where we are faced with the choice of, we need to act. And I think that's what Dorian has shown us. Okay, we have done a lot of work. It may not, everyone may not be aware, but people who have been working in this field have been thinking about climate change for quite some time. And we have predicted certain patterns. Climate scientists, not me and not Nikita and not, I mean, we're more like communicators and thinking about how do we address this. So what can the Bahamas do? Because it does sound hopeless, right? When you have these conversations, it sounds like it's terrifying. And it is terrifying when you think about what Bahamians experienced last year, literally a year ago. And it is scary and it is traumatic. I did not even experience that, but I was in New Providence worrying about family, when in the aftermath, you're trying to help in any way you can. And I was traumatized and I didn't even live through 25-foot surge waves. And but we have to be able to look at these events take care of our people immediately. We have to think about what we do for people now, but we have to make sure that we're thinking about 15 years, 30, 40 years. And this is where some of the arts and people that are focused on culture too, because what happens if nothing changes and we face these unbelievably hard to wrap our head around scenarios? We have to figure out what the plan is. And I would argue that we've done some of that thinking. One of the things that we may not be prepared to think about is the fact that we need to think about, how do we migrate if we need to? How do we take our cultural assets and how do we take all of those social elements with us if we have to do that? People are already doing it in other countries. So we have to be very realistic, but we need to also come from this from a place of hope, because if we feel like there's no hope, then what is the point, right? So I'm going to pause and just give somebody else a chance because I know the sciencey ones have been kind of dominating the conversation, but it definitely is not about blame. It's about where are we and what do we do at this point?
Tamika, it would be great to hear from you about the work that you've done to document. And if you could just, going back to the definitions, tell us what it means to document and what an archive is, and how you've used it in these.
Yeah. Sure. So a lot of people, and I kind of remove the word documentary from my bios because a lot of people, when they read that, I often get approached and asked, when your documentary film coming out? Well, that's define exactly what makes up the documentary art. So it's not only film, it's an account of, it can be writing through memoir, it can be autobiography, it can be biography, it can be speculative writing, okay? It can be anything ranging from a podcast to a vlog, traditional documentary photography. And in my case, I make experimental art also, which involves hybrids that kind of fuse the ocean and the human population, okay? In terms of archives, what we are used to usually is something of historical significance that's been stored someplace out of reach of everyday people, right? But I want us to think about what are our own personal archives. And those are the things that are very, very important right now when we think about being in climate crisis. Our family photo albums, our family films, mementos that hold great familial value to us, heirlooms, anything that you could stand to lose in the event of a storm, right? Anything of value to you that you would suffer greatly if you lose it is a part of your personal archive. And I want us to think about how we keep those things that we hold so dear and important to us safe during this time of climate crisis. Like, you know, I heard Fallon say, you know, we've referenced Dorian, but please, let's back up a little bit and talk about 2017 when Irma and Maria displaced our Ragged Islanders. You know, people weren't paying attention then, and we're kind of not paying attention now, even when the government made this big hullabaloo about making that our first green city, and we're gonna make all these improvements, blah, 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 blah. And now Great Ragged Island is for sale, okay? So that was our very first, not our very first, in my lifetime, that was the first instance of climate migration that happened within our archipelago. We saw Ragged Islanders displaced from, and the government did a very good job of getting them out of Ragged Island. Let me say that, okay? Because if they'd stayed, Lord knows, we would have experienced something much more devastating than we did at that point, right? But what is happening to the Ragged Islanders now? And then of course, we knew what happened just a year ago in Dorian, and we never, ever, ever thought that was gonna happen. We had been saying the Bahamas is gonna disappear. I think IDB's Blue Urban Agenda laid it out very easily and accessibly in 2017 in saying that the Bahamas is the most extreme case of low elevation coastal zones in the Caribbean. And to translate that loosely, girl, you in trouble, okay? It's complicated that we live in a coastal zone where, as Fallon brought up, just a tiny bit of sea level rise is gonna make such a big difference. When we see what happens in Grand Bahama and we see what happened in the Abacos on masses of land that are far greater than New Providence, could you imagine? Could you imagine? You see what the city looks like when we have just a little bit of rain. To say that the Bahamas is going to disappear just a few years ago was unfathomable. And when we talk to people about it now, everyone's like, that's so macabre. Why we got to think about that? But it's a reality. And we see it happening in the Pacific. It's already happening to the Solomon Islands. A quick Google search, you don't even have to do no deep academic dive to figure out what's happening in the Solomons. The waterline has been pushed back. They have to leave an entire island and go somewhere else because of sea level rise. And we cannot be ignorant in thinking that that's not gonna happen here. Or, you know, I've heard some people say, well, 100 years is not in my lifetime, so I'm not worried about it. And that's a horrible stance to take because we are not in this thing by ourselves. I'm rambling, so.
No, and I think you make very valid points. And I think even in Abaco, for example, Francis, I was talking to one of my colleagues who was displaced in Abaco because, I mean, it's not the first time that individual communities have been devastated. And actually some of the, what he was telling me is that, you know, a lot of basically the boom in Abaco came out of after Francis and after some of the hurricanes where you had VAT relief, not VAT because they didn't have VAT then, but when they, you know, all of these incentives to rebuild. And so, no, it's not new. And to highlight a few things, I mean, the Bahamas has been communicating and been, you know, ratifying all these different agreements, and I would never presume to know all of them. I think Shelley Kant is on the webinar, so she could add anything in the chat to help with this. But you know, I think we did our first communication to the UN or whatever body in 2001. And
no. In 92, the small islands, developing states of the world was like, world, listen up. Y'all need to take climate action.
It was like the first national communication in 2001. The point is,
the National Commission, but
the point is, I meant from the Bahamas specifically. Okay. So, but the point is, we've not just started thinking about this, right? And organizations like the Bahamas National Trust, the government, fisheries, every organization that has the best commission, which is now Department of Environmental Planning, Protection and Planning recently, everyone has been incorporating climate change in our planning, in our conversations. And I mean, I think it's more real to everybody because we're humans, right? You can talk about something, especially climate change, with it being so kind of abstract and you need to put all these things together. But we haven't just started. And so I think when we talk about resilience, we have done some really great things in the Bahamas that set us up for resilience. We have established a system of protected areas. And how does that help us? Because we know that natural systems help buffer against the impacts of climate change. Now, yes, that doesn't help you if your sea levels are rising at a rate that they can't keep up with, right? But it's certainly better than having lost all that, all those systems to begin with. So we got to start with where we are. We have in the Bahamas National Trust portfolio, over 2 million acres under protection right now. Varying levels of management, right? And different management objectives for those protected areas. And there are protected areas that fall under forestry, that fall under the Department of Marine Resources. And we have a lot of really robust legislations, recently made even more robust by the 2019 amendments, right? That we have good policies in place. we just have to get better at kind of communicating them. Sorry if you hear, that's my dogs in the background, if y'all could hear, right? So we need to do a better job of communicating those and integrating our work, because it's not just the government's job and it's not just a nonprofit's job, it's everybody's job to be integrating, investing in nature in all of our work, because everyone is at risk. And I will agree that the poor and those people that are more disadvantaged are going, and that's well documented, that we are in small island developing states, the first to feel it, but even more so marginalized communities, the poor, the disabled, those people are going to be impacted even more greatly, because those who have the resources will move, will adapt, will be able to get out of the way, essentially. But it is not just simply, oh, we haven't accomplished anything. Nikita, I see you.
No, well, so I don't think it's that we haven't accomplished anything. I would never say that. And so just to clarify, the small island developing states as a bloc in 92 spoke to, the need for us to reduce our CO2 levels because of the impacts of climate change. But it was in 2001 when it was our first national communication. I think it's really important for us to notice what is a priority for us in our country. And I think this is the greatest teller and speaks to how and if we are truly taking bold and ambitious climate action. And this is where yes, there's been some things happening, but I don't think it's been enough. I mean, we have a Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, or whatever that the official name is, or the department, the new department that was established after Dorian.
That was a restructuring effort, right? I mean, it moved NEMA and the basically, if you're preparing for disasters, you also need to prepare for how you deal with them after.
So,
right? And that wasn't entirely.
Hold on. Let me finish my point, please. But my point is that why didn't we develop a ministry focused specifically for climate action or climate change or climate justice? All right, how we prioritize what we invest in a country is very important. And absolutely, we have to prepare for disasters, and also we have to be part of, having these conversations that will chart the course forward for us, because we are faced with some harsh, brutal realities. Even the thought of having a conversation about where do we go, how do we relocate, how do we even begin to have those conversations where people are in flood zones and you're like, well, you can't rebuild there. Knowing that the first people who will be impacted most likely by that are the most vulnerable, which are then going to impact and make the divides that exist in our country that much greater. And so as we move forward, I think it's really important for us as a nation, we have to be setting the pace, because right now, the pace for climate action, the pace for how the world evolves and is addressing climate change is being set by primarily nations in the global north. So whether it's Canada, places in Europe, they're not faced with our realities. Our story, our face is never really the face of climate change, but yet we are the first and of the very first to suffer. And so this is where I believe we have to be extremely intentional about 100%. We have to transform the way that we live, and we have to become a lot more sustainable, because things are going to be changing rapidly, and we want to be ahead of that and to be able to flow with that change. And I think we have to, this is a fight, and we have to show up together and be extremely, and there has to be a plan, because right now we do not have a plan.
So I think that we have components of a plan, and let me tell you why. Because there's a project ongoing right now that is, the name of the project has changed, but there is an integrated coastal zone management project that has been in the works for a while. right? You can say, yes, there are challenges with all these projects, right? But currently now that is looking at how do you do restoration along coastlines and mangroves? How do you make your...
How many Bahamians know about that? You and I know about those.
Now you're getting to my point, Nikita. And so that's why the conversation has to shift from, we are in a crisis, we're in a burning building, let's get out. The conversation has to shift to, okay, can we please highlight where we are, what we know, and what we don't know? Because we know a lot of things. The National Development Plan we have a draft from 2017, the second draft, right? A lot of consultation took place in communities that went into that plan. And I would argue that one of our biggest challenges in this country on every level, not just nonprofit, in the government and everywhere, is that we need to reinvent the wheel when we get into some position where we want to achieve something. We have to be able to say, okay, this is a crisis, it is a crisis, but how do we objectively and critically address what we know, and where can we adapt our plans or adapt our strategies and do it in a way where we don't have to vilify or we don't have to discount the progress, because we also need to give people hope. And I agree with you that people do not know. And I would say that is a big problem, that we have not communicated enough, right? But there's also room for an improvement in citizen engagement in governance, right? Because a lot has changed in the last 7 years even. There's a lot of information online that can be accessed. And yes, we have issues with accessibility, right? But even those people in the private sector who want government to do this, and this, right? Do they make themselves aware of the policies that impact them? Okay, the recent NPO Act, that everyone now is acting as though they've never seen any legislation, when in fact, it's been decades in the works. And the Civil Society Bahamas and the Organization for Responsible Governance actually gave a lot of feedback to the Attorney General before it was, right? So my point is, yes, critique all the way, right? Because that's what causes the change. But let's please acknowledge our successes, because in terms of the environment, for our capacity, what are SIDS characterized by? Weak systems that, because of our colonial history, a lot of our colonial history, right? Lack of resources, capital, human, all of these. For all of those things considered, we are young and we are growing, right? But we need to be transparent, open, but we need to be thinking about progress, not just, okay, we're in a crisis. We need to think strategy, Nikita.
Okay, can I interject something here and ask a few questions? I hear a lot of talk about the environment, and lovely. I assume that is your area of expertise, but I'm not hearing very much about humans. I'm interested in what's happening on a more micro to then macro level. What are we going to do about, I hear you talking about protected areas. I hear you talking about, mangroves and whatnot. And I'm assuming marine protected areas, and Nikita knows this living in Cat Island, and I lived in Cat Island for the last year, but there are no shelters. There are no real shelters. What's going to happen to the people? When are we going to have a real conversation about migration? That was brought up earlier, but when are we going to have a real conversation about migration? Because there's only so much shifting we can do around the archipelago when we talk about moving islanders from one to the other internally. I hear you talking about giving the government credit where they deserve it, but I have to say that there's a level of privilege going on in this conversation that kind of leaves out the layman. Mm-hmm. There's these studies, these organizations, nonprofit, government, private, whatever the hell they are not accessible to people who are living this, who are going to be most impacted. The communities that COVID has exposed as being the most vulnerable, okay? We are not having grassroots movements and conversations with these people about what it really means to be displaced and what their options are. These people are right now trying to keep themselves alive, right? You see how many people we had on the food line? These people are worried about not having any income at the current moment. Most of the time, it's not that much to even shout about, right? So we talk about a certain level of privilege you have to prepare for these kinds of disasters. People are trying to educate their children. They're trying to stay alive. We didn't even talk about the crime rate yet, okay? So when we talk about climate, which is climate change and climate resilience and climate justice, these things that we can more easily wrap our heads around if we have access to these things, if we are in the academy, if we are in these organizations, if we have access to these things, we can wrap our heads around them. People who are dealing with everyday life are not thinking about that. That could quite easily be in the next century for them. It's not something that they're worried about because it's not affecting them right now. How do we get into these communities? And I'm asking a question. I'm not passing judgment. I'm seriously asking a question. How do we, and Ashley, maybe you can chime in here, how do we talk to these people that are most vulnerable?
Well, the question there is...
Cut you off, but just to briefly respond that I do definitely come from the perspective of the environment, but we can talk more about how that, considering the environment's connection to economy, how that plays into people. But go ahead, Ashley, but that's where I come from. And this talk is about climate and environment, and those things are very much interrelated.
But it also connects to people, Fallon, and Tamika makes a very important point that when it comes to the environment, people don't care about the environment if they don't have any money to get food at the end of the day.
I don't want to cut Ashley off, so, but I will.
Oh, no, I just wanted a brief response on that. Not a problem.
Yeah.
Well, and kind of what Fallon was saying with the issue, well, at the end of the day, when you're thinking specifically about climate change and how you communicate that to people, it's your question of framing. And when you think of framing, it's what angle do you need to take to make this relevant to this person? What angle do you need to take to make someone care about it? So for Nikita, Fallon, and I, we have the science perspective. And so like talking about it from, just a purely environmental and biological and ecological perspective, that's relevant to us. But like you're saying that like, if someone needs to eat, ecology doesn't matter. Like it's the bush, who cares? But if you can find a way that says, okay, well, we have an issue with food security. And if we were to be able to create more circular systems, so a system that doesn't rely so heavily on importing food, but if we could create a system internally that can, compost things better and, set up something that would, and then that at the end, and then, frame the climate problem from the perspective of, if we can make if we can kind of ensure better food security, or better food security will be an outcome of us making these sustainable actions or these sustainable choices. And, that's just an example, but like, and I agree that if people have their basic needs are not met, they do not care about bigger problems. If you are worried about your shelter, if you're worried about your food, you're worried about access to clean water. And so I think if we're trying to get buy-in from communities who have no real reason to care about the academic side of things, it's a matter of thinking about, okay, well, what is your problem? So if your problem is water security, well, this is how climate's going to affect that and how it's going to make that worse. So what can we, and I agree with Fallon in terms of like, we do need to think about the progress that's made. We need to think about hope and strategies and solutions, because it is very easy to slide into despair. And so thinking about it from the perspective of like, okay, well, what are your needs and what can we do? How will sustainable action make your life better? Because I think for a lot, and sort of a bit tangentially, I think for a lot of people, taking sustainable action is thinking about sustainability and climate change is a bit of a privilege. Taking sustainable action is also a privilege that I think, because these timescales are in the hundreds of years, or in like 50, 20, 30 years, 100 years, and people do live day to day, it's almost a bit like that deferred gratification. And I don't know if you guys, so the idea of deferred gratification is, can you not have something now so that you can have something better later? I can't think of a really good example that doesn't involve food, but you can probably think of an example of that. And so as a society, we're struggling with that sense of deferred gratification, that we want fancy, cool stuff now. We want to drive and I mean, I'm saying this from as someone who has to drive to work every day, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend like I don't contribute, but I think that as a society, we want what we want now. And we're not willing to think about the future in that, to a certain extent. And I think that tying that back into the privilege piece is that, again, like framing sustainability as an attractive option, because I think when people think of sustainability, it means like not being able to have, and especially when, and I think I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of people of color and and class and that kind of thing, where, you know, in order to be sustainable, you can't have what the top people have. And well, I want that because that's something to aspire to, but that lifestyle is the most damaging. And this is kind of somewhere where that conversation has been linking to with, you know, the biggest contributors of climate change are developed nations, and people aspire to that, but that has been the biggest cause of climate change. So how do we sort of reconcile, how do we present some sort of lifestyle that looks attractive and looks sustainable and appealing, that doesn't feel like it's just you are stuck in a cycle of you can't have this because now it's bad because it's not good for the environment. It's like, well, I've wanted this. You told me this is what I should aim for. So sorry, it's a bit of a ramble, but I think that there's a lot of the whole, how do we get buy-in from people? How do we communicate this to people in a way that is relevant to them on a personal level, on a day-to-day level? Is like, how can sustainability make your life better instead of making it mean that you can't have nice things? Because I think that at the end of the day, we are humans, but we are also animals, and we want nice stuff, and we get mad if someone else has nice stuff and we don't get to have it, right? So like there is that whole piece of like, yeah, I'm sorry, a bit of a ramble, but I think that's one way of integrating the human aspect of it, is like, okay, how do we meet people's needs, and how can sustainability help to do that? Yeah, and that's kind of my 2 cents on that. But
I think you made some really important points, Ashley, around what we value and what we learn to value, and how that impacts the way that we behave, and our quality of life, right? Because we think that our value for certain things, like a fancy new gas guzzling car, right, is going to improve our quality of life, but it actually makes it worse by its impact on the environment, and the environment affects the way that
you're also sitting more. You're also sitting more, which is bad for you, right?
Yeah. But I think the connection to food, and I think the reason that you can't really think of any examples of anything but food, is because food is the most basic thing. If people are hungry, they don't care about anything else. And food security is so important. And I don't think we really paid attention to it until this time last year. And then we sort of stopped paying attention to it for a while. And then COVID-19 happened. And then we were like, oh, wait. And all of a sudden, people were like flooding my little plant shop, trying to get like vegetables and stuff to grow, right? Like all of a sudden people want to grow food. And that's a great thing. So why aren't we talking more about that? Why aren't we providing people with more resources? Like, I want to see MPs and NGOs and influencers, if we have them, if you exist and you're really out there, I want to see you out there giving people the tools that they need to start their own gardens. Like, people could even grow kitchen gardens if you don't have yard space, right? Like, you just find the right window. When are we going to create the resources to show people how to do this and how to be a little bit less reliant on imports, reliant on money? I know that activist Erin Green talks a lot about the issue. One of the biggest problems that we have is that we have learned to solve problems with money. And it means that when you don't have money, or when you have a problem that money can't solve, you're stuck, right? Like you're just completely trapped. So how do we figure out ways to talk to people about these issues, like you're saying, Ashley, in ways that actually connect to their real lived experiences? And I think it's one of the things that, it's one of the areas that we fall down on a lot, not just in talking about climate and environment. We fall down on it in a lot of areas of policymaking, lots of different advocacy topics. I mean, it's one of the reasons that We got a full-on like 4 no's in the referendum because we just weren't connecting with people and their real everyday lives and being able to connect these sort of like in the sky issues. Like, how does this matter to me right now when I'm working 2 jobs, and when I get home, I need to help my children with their homework, and then I need to get back out the door for another job, and then I come home and sleep for 2 hours. And then I like quickly eat a yogurt or something before I have to get them to school. You know, like people are in this cycle. And I think that connects back to what Tamika and Marjan were saying about, I guess, in response to that conversation about getting people, why aren't people doing more? Why don't we care more? And it's just because we don't have the capacity. I think a lot of people do not have the capacity to give a shit about a single other thing outside of their house. And we can't blame them for that. We have to figure out ways to engage people that does not require more of their time, money, and energy, or does not highlight for them the complete lack of those 3 resources. I think that's a major, major gap that we have. And then back to the food thing, there was a comment earlier from Sam saying, what about our diet? One of the biggest drivers of climate change, I guess, is our diet. And I know you had your hand raised, Sam, so I'm going to come to you in a second. But one of the other things I wanted to say is that doing hurricane relief work, Equality Bahamas did like 6 months with Linda Ham Bahamas. It was really interesting to me that we were dealing with a climate event, a climate disaster. And in terms of donations and things like that, we were getting so much bottled water, like individual plastic bottles of water. And it was just like, how do we do this in another way? Because people do need the water and we do need to be able to easily distribute it. But can we make it make sense? Can we make it less wasteful? You know, there are so many questions and it takes a lot of work to be able to work out those answers and chart a path forward. And it's not something that we can just do on the fly. Like we've seen that with these 2 back-to-back crises, right? Like it's not possible to see something blow up and then just have a plan. You're just like, you're in motion right away. So everyone can't be in that motion of trying to respond right away. There have to be people who are in the back, figuring out policy, figuring out strategy, figuring out community engagement, figuring out the rollout of different programs. We all can't do the same thing at the same time. Sam, are you still there and wanting to chime in here?
Hi.
Give you a second. Yeah, hi.
I'm here. Thank you for having me. Okay, so I wanted to address a couple of the comments that I've heard along the way. In terms of, you know, I have personally been involved in environmental communication for 30 years, and climate change is a very difficult issue to communicate with people. And I think that while, yes, it's absolutely important for people to, for everybody to understand what is going on, the point is I don't actually believe we have the time to wait for everybody to understand. The ones of us that know what is happening have to go after the government very hard to start making the changes that need to happen. And I get it that, you know, at the end of the day, even if we did everything right, the possibility that we're still going to be underwater is very high because all the other countries have to do it right. But the Bahamas is one of the most polluting islands on planet Earth. So we also need to start stepping up to the plate in terms of our responsibility, our collective responsibility as a nation and as individuals to stop this. Even on an individual level, when I talk about climate, they know that, I mean, study after study has been done where they know that the methane from cows and pigs and chickens and all the farm animals, the mass agricultural farming that is going on with animals is contributing significantly to climate change. So, you know, when we go back to the issue of responsibility, we each have a responsibility to make those changes. And, you know, food is a very emotional issue. And it's a difficult issue to move beyond. But, you know, for example, one of the biggest ironies for me after Dorian was I was working, well, I had gone to volunteer to do the food distribution with Head Knowles, and the cases and cases and cases of corned beef were just like, wow, we don't get it. You know, the very reason that we are having these issues in our country is because the Amazon is burning, is because of our addiction to meat in particular. So, yeah, I mean, listen, I get it. It's very frustrating. It's a huge, complicated issue. I do absolutely wish that, you know, more people got it, but I don't think we're in a place anymore to wait for everybody to get on board. You know, there's enough of us out here that actually know when we went after the Disney thing. I mean, Disney is essentially going to go into a marine protected area, or proposed marine protected area. And, you know, we as a nation tend to back down. If the government jumps up and says, no, we're going ahead, we say, oh, well, that's a done issue. We can't move on. We need to work together more. We need to be cohesive in our approach to dealing with these issues. You know, the cruise industry is another huge issue in terms of the amount of pollution it creates, not only air pollution, but dumping in our waters, the pollution of exterminating our culture. And that's essentially what they're going to do in Eleuthera. I mean, by the looks of things, there's nothing planned that even looks remotely like the Bahamas. And even though they've gone and captured a number of people to say, we're going to work with you, the reality is at the end of the day, they're going to imagine whatever they want to imagine, and too bad for us. The economics on the project absolutely suck. Disney's going to be making $830 million a month, and we're going to be making $33 million a month. Those are some of the bigger issues that I see in terms of, you know, moving forward, actually sitting together. All of us care about the environment on this group. All of us understand to a certain extent the level of danger we are in. And that is why we absolutely have to support one another's issues and be there for one another. Just speaking personally, I can tell you that over the last 30 years, I think that we have been our biggest enemy. We don't stick together. We let the environmentalists go out there and scream by themselves. We let the social justice people scream for themselves. And until we actually get it in our heads that we're all in this together, that we all have to work together, we're going to continue to talk around the same issues again and again. So
if I may say something, please. There's been a lot of really interesting points, and I think we have to be honest, all right? We have people, the majority of our Bahamians are living in crisis mode and don't have money, right? So after Hurricane Dorian, the biggest explanation as to why the hurricane stalled over Grand Bahama was because of HARP, and that the US was trying to get China out of their backyard. Okay, so we have to, I think it's really important. It's very easy for us, especially those of us who have been socialized in academia, who take for granted our understanding of the environment, who are not waking up every day trying to make the $50 to get and go to the store to get a little bit of grits and a can of corned beef because that's what they got for the day. You know, like, and I think this is our greatest problem, is that the people, the majority of the people who are making the decisions, their lived realities are so far from the reality of the majority of Bahamians. And I think many Bahamians, we aren't true about the financial challenges and the debt that people are in. I think a lot of us are fronting, and I mean, like, you know, I think it's very easy for people to look at me and make assumptions and assume that I have access to a lot of things. I haven't had a salary in a year, you know? And so I believe many of us are trying to to survive in the best way that we can. And what makes this, I think, additionally challenging is that we're trying to survive. We have a population that's extremely challenged when it comes to the level of education. You know, there's a small percentage of us who have been afforded, university, even if it was in country, right? And there's even less of us who went off. But the majority of us don't. And our comprehension is really low. And so we have to develop meaningful conversations. And I think a big part of this is going back to what Tamika spoke about earlier. And sort of, I think Ashley also touched on it too, about this need for us to buy. You know, I believe we have to stop, pause, and do a serious audit of our lives, because we have become so caught up in attaining a lifestyle that's based on the American dream, which is not attainable for us. And I believe it's important for us to acknowledge that change can be amazing, right? We have to allow ourselves to imagine an alternative reality that is better, but we have to be part of creating it. And the only way that we're going to be able to do and make meaningful strides, you know, we have a poverty issue. And so if people cannot meet their basic needs, we're not going to move anywhere. There was a week a couple months ago where I didn't have, I had $3, and with $3 I could get 1 gallon of water, whereas in a 5 gallon of water is $6. And so if you're constantly stuck in this cycle of poverty, and it's, for someone like me, it's a bit easier because I have the confidence, and I know that, like, my situation was is temporary. But a lot of people don't have that security that their financial situation is temporary. And so they're in the struggle all the time. And I believe this is where our conversation has to come back to the people, and it has to become relevant. And we have to start to listen, because I can have all the ideas I want about how I need to conserve this and protect that and monitor these reefs but if I am not honestly listening to the people in my community, if I am assuming that I know what is best, especially when, think about the net worth of our politicians, think about the net worth of, the majority of people who are in leadership decisions. And we have seen this, those of us who live in the Family Islands, man, like food security. I was just in the grocery store. There's nothing, we don't have anything. I can't tell you the last time we've had vegetables in the grocery store here in Cat Island, like for weeks. And the only food that there is canned food, because that's what lasts, that's what people can afford. When the shutdowns were on and off, it was even worse. So we have to radically reimagine what it means to live on these islands. And I believe that means we have to have a really frank and uncomfortable audit. But I believe we have to do that from a position of love, saying that we can, maybe the form of conservation that we've been using or employing, maybe it hasn't been the best thing. I think we have to allow ourselves, and I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying that we need to realize that the same form of thinking that has enabled us to carry us to this far, we have to break these barriers down. And the only way that we're going to survive is that if we are the ones who are leading the charge, and that's on a global level. So, and Sam, I completely agree from the fact that we have to improve how we work together. And I believe a big part of this goes back to this belief of worth. I believe so often as Bahamians in the nonprofit sector, but just in general, we are so competitive. We are constantly operating from a position of lack, a position of scarcity, that if you are doing something good, it means it's taking away from my shine, which is not the case. But I believe this creates barriers for us to meaningfully work together. And so improving our ability to communicate with each other, improving our ability to really take an audit of where we are without judgment, right? But understand that we have a functionally illiterate society, and that impacts how we move forward with education. And Sam, I disagree. I fully disagree with you when you say that, yes, there are a handful of us who, yes, that we have to be making noise. And I know a lot of us are doing things in different ways, but we can't just forget the masses, because this is the problem right now, is that, and this is, you hear any single conversation in Cat Island or any of the other family islands that I've spent time on, and it's us versus them. It's the environmentalists versus the community. And we have to dismantle that, because it is we, the collective. But that means we have to establish trust, because right now, regardless of where we are in this moment, there are people in our community that do not trust our leaders, that do not trust environmental organizations. There's a lot of distrust, and we have to be very intentional about addressing that. And we can't come in with being like, because we're assuming we know the best. And so what I do want to share is a solution to this, because I think it's very easy for us to tear apart. And I want to share one of the things that I'm working on how we can help to drive this change. And so one of the projects that we're doing with the Cat Island Conservation Institute is that we're training community scientists. So going back to the very beginning of the conversation, Fallon was talking about science. And I love science because it's a lens that I see the world. It's a lens for understanding problems that exist. Most of us who are scientists, who are working in the environmental world, maybe 7 more years, if you have a master's degree, studying out of the country probably to get your degree. We don't got the time for that. But what we do know is that we need to ensure that Bahamians can have these skills to understand the world in which they are living with. So what we're doing with Young Marine Explorers and the Cat Island Conservation Institute is that we're developing various tracks for community scientists. We have a community marine scientist track, a community geoscientist track, a community hydro track, which is creating a trade. It's a new job opportunity to train someone who may not have graduated from high school, but they're not stupid. But we have to meet people where they are, and we have to be intentional about ensuring that the members in our communities are equipped with the skills so we can do this together. Because otherwise, I believe the divide is just going to grow greater and greater and greater. And we know what happens. Crime skyrockets, and the Bahamas is very quickly becoming a place that Bahamians are not going to be able to afford to live in. And we're going to start to see more refugees. So we really have to, I believe Ashley was mentioning this, be intentional about how we are creating new economic opportunities. How can we ensure that people can have a quality life, not a $5 an hour type of, you can't live off that, right? So we have to begin to redefine what quality of life means. And so talking about food, a question that I always ask is what is our standard for no hunger in the Bahamas? Is it just that people have grits and some canned meat? Is that what we're saying, that everyone's good with that? Or are we saying no, we want everyone to have access to fresh vegetables and. But we have to become very clear about defining, and you see that I've got this sustainable development goals behind me, but defining what each sustainable development goals means specifically to us in the Bahamas, in our local communities. And until we can define it for ourselves, we're going to continue to flail and see this divide.
So I'd like to chime in and make sure that several things are clear. As a Bahamian, as someone that lives in these communities, I have lived in Eleuthera as well. And I will say that living in Eleuthera opened my eyes to a different perspective. I mean, I didn't know until I lived in Eleuthera that some people, and I'm not even saying that that's a center for poverty or anything. I just was closer to people in the communities where I lived and worked. And I hadn't been in the Bahamas because I was in school and working in the States for about 7 years, but I grew up and I did all of my high school here. And so I became really, really aware of, okay, some people haven't had running water come into their house their entire life. right? They're still going to a standpipe to get water. The challenge is though that I do speak from the environment because I don't speak in areas that I'm not qualified to talk about, okay? I'm not a social scientist. But what I do know is that social science is critical and intentional, genuine engagement of communities is necessary for environmental protection. But let's remember why we are protecting the environment, regardless of personalities and egos and things like that. What it really comes down to in the Bahamas is we are protecting, it's so cliche, but we are protecting our way of life. Everyone's, not just the wealthy, and we could talk, yes, about how there's disparity, right? But the truth of the matter is, if you allow shared resources like any aspect of the environment, if you allow those to degrade and you don't protect them, the poor are disproportionately impacted. And the impact that protected areas, and I talk about protected areas because I love them. And I believe, and that's, that's not scientific, but from a scientific point of view, they are really well demonstrated to protect a wide variety. And I'm talking about environment too, because we're talking about environment, okay? So they're really good at protecting the resources that people depend on, right? And you need a system to protect even just one species. Consider conch, which is a huge part of our culture, a part of our economy. It is a part of, you could think of any level of our society and you could tie conch into that, okay? We now, even as we call them, people use the conch, okay? So it is intimately woven into our society. Can we envision a future without conch? But here's what goes into ensuring that we do. And I know I'm not talking to you, Nikita, because I know you know, right? But we're talking about communicating why we do this. And it's not to tell people that they must have the same idea about how we achieve our goal. But here's the truth. Science is telling us, the research is telling us that intervention is needed for that species, right? That we understand the way conch reproduce. There needs to be a certain amount of them in a certain area, because guess what? They have sex, right? They have to find each other. And if there are too little of them in an area, they can't have sex. It matters, right? And then when they reproduce, they don't carry their young in their body. They put it out into the ocean and then it travels on the tides. So you can't just protect one area, right? You have to protect multiple components. And there has been research that has gone into how we have established protected areas in the country. So we have done what we've called, and this is not we as in BNT, all of these protected area managers have done what we call gap analyses. And a lot of that involved community engagement and asking people, okay, which areas, we need to identify those critical areas, right? And so a conch that is in the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, the most recent research out of the Exuma Keys Land and Sea Park, which is a no-take zone. Most of our national parks are not no-takes, right? In the sense that you can have some kinds of activities taking place where you can fish and things like that. But the Exuma Keys is specifically managed as a fisheries resource so that things in that area can grow, reproduce, and spill over into other areas. And it's doing that really well for conch. But all of the population in that protected area is aging, okay? And we know that conch populations can collapse. The Keys, the Florida Keys, other areas throughout the Caribbean, we have some of the best fisheries resources, partially because of legislation that we put in the past, right? To do with long lining and things like that. It's part of the reason why we have healthy shark populations, which contribute significantly to the economy, and not just to those that own, but all the people that are employed in those. But taking this back to Eleuthera, I worked as a part of a team that, we had a team of 11 people. Those 11 people had quality, decent jobs and working full time. and had room for growth, right? And I'm using the BNT as an example because that's where I've worked for the last like 7 years. But this is true around the world, right? You can have impact on, and the spillover effect of employing people and giving people those opportunities. And Sam, I personally agree that Disney wasn't the best option for that, for Lighthouse Point. BNT worked on that, right? I was depressed after that decision was made. But the solution is not simply to say, okay, that has happened, bad Bahamas, right? We have to say, okay, we have several overlapping areas, and they all impact people, because if we allow the environment to degrade and we don't engage people, and also I don't agree that you can't engage the masses, Sam, because you cannot police and you cannot enforce regulations like these, right? You have to have people bought in and supporting them. So it makes no sense. If you want a protected area to be effective, and whether you're the point of the protected area or whatever you could be protecting a unique species, or you could be protecting some kind of really cool geologic formation like the primeval forest in New Providence, which is accessible to Bahamians, right? So we have to realize that people need these systems. And when we think about COVID, I know that for me, I would never, Nikita, we've had this conversation. I don't call myself a mermaid because I am not a marine person. I love terrestrial systems. I love forests and birds, and I want to go for a walk in the forest, right? And not being able to do that was difficult. I mean, mentally challenging, but all the people who rely on going to the beach, and we had conversations about this, Nikita, and I said, okay, on my private Facebook, I said, how can they put in these regulations and then say, okay, they're just going to close the beach, right? Manage it, give people access, control the access. And that stemmed into other conversations. The point is, I completely agree with everyone, what you're saying, but we have to be realistic, right? Several things: shared resources, common goods degrade if we do not protect them. And yes, people are critical to making that protection effective, but they are the one, everyone, and it's no they, we are the ones that are going to benefit from this. And yes, we are, everyone's saying, well, we don't have time, we don't have time, we don't have time. The Bahamas does have to figure out what it wants to achieve over the next, 50 years. But also the Sustainable Development Goals were considered in the National Development Plan. I think these conversations are so necessary, but think about my role in the organization now at BNT. Okay, how do you go from values, goals, objectives, strategies? How do we get to what we actually need to do? And a part of that is recognizing, please, if we're running out of time, let's not spend time doing work that has already been done. I'm not saying the work is perfect. I'm saying let's be realistic about where we need to focus our energy, because if you put energy in the wrong place, you are adding resources, and that's not the problem. And I'm not saying it's not part of the problem. We need to strengthen local government, right? We need to add resources where it's needed. And there are lots of things coming around that are exciting for environment right now. The Bahamas Protected Area Fund, which the government created as a corporation to bring money into protected areas management. And people benefit from protected areas in Grand Bahama, the Lucayan National Park, jobs. When tours were running, more people visit Gold Rock Beach than anywhere else in Lucayan National Park, okay? And spillover effects of that, the concessions that are available. And BNT recognizes that we have to invest more in the infrastructure and make these areas more beneficial to communities. It's a recognition that we have, and we have put in our strategic plan, and that we are working towards. The GEF 2020 project. The GEF is simply an international mechanism for giving money to countries, right? And we're bringing millions of dollars into the country to get work done, because it takes money to do work. And over the next 5 years, through the GEF project, we will be adding infrastructure in key parks so that people can access them, and people can use them and gain these benefits. So it's not an all or nothing conversation. And when I talk about the environment, I'm talking about people, because Bahamians, more than most people in the world, really, really, really depend on the environment. And I would argue that people have seen that too with COVID. Yes, we've gone back to gardening. Agriculture is a different topic altogether. We know that we have very poor soils, and that's a serious challenge. So I have problems with people that want to talk about large scale mass, agriculture here. Community gardens, that's great. But people depend on the forest and the ocean for their own needs, for fishing. And if we don't protect those resources, we harm the people that we're trying to protect. Sorry, that was very long, but yes.
Well, and I think some of, sorry.
Sorry, Ashley. I just wanted to, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Okay. So polite. No, here. Just 2 seconds. Just one thing about the whole reliance. I think people's perception of the environment, and I think this kind of ties back into a desire to protect that. I mean, I think some people who are living, I'm envisioning, particularly on the Family Islands, who are have much more of a subsistence relationship with the environment, have a very different perspective than people who don't have to rely on the environment for food. And either way, there's a question of how do we make people have a positive feeling about the environment? Because even when people go to the beach, and I did it as a child, as soon as there's seaweed, you're like, ew, yuck, and like running away, right? And people have this very almost divorced relationship with the natural environment. And like, I guess it's the idea of using it for recreation, or the idea of just having these, like, I'm trying to figure out how to articulate this, but I think there's also some piece, all of this conversation also ties in with, we're trying to get buy-in. How do we persuade people that the environment is valuable for them on a personal level, not just the economic side of it, but how do you as a person have positive feelings about your local environment? And both from the marine and beach perspective, but also from the terrestrial environment, right? So like, how do we add that into the conversation that people, I think, like, and this kind of ties a little bit to what Alicia was saying about the food thing. And I think people have it again ties into values. People have a bit of a negative association with working with your hands, with working with the soil. I think in general, like culturally, I think a lot of the push has been, I got an office job, that's what I want. They want to have that separation from being out in nature or being out in the elements, really. So how do we make that positive for people? How do we make people feel good about being outside and being in nature and enjoying it, and not just like balking at anything that moves? Sorry, it was just a bit of a tangent, but just something that kind of adds to that, I guess.
Slowly changing, actually. I think people are starting to like get into it. Tamika, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, Ashley and Alicia, and Nikita touched on this earlier, that lived experience on the Family Islands is much different than lived experience here in the capital, because there are people there who are sustaining their lifestyles by growing. Okay, so when we talk about good and bad relationships to getting our hands in the soil and actually doing this farming, I think we have to really look at the factors that influence how are people in the capital living, and what's happening around that experience, and why are there more people. Well, obviously, the Family Islanders are growing because that's how they have to sustain their lifestyle. But the ideas and attitudes around growing there are much, much different. I mean, the disparity in views and values around farming on the Family Island and the capital are completely different. So maybe this is something that we need to explore from, and this is kind of where the documentarian people come in. This is where the people in the humanities come in. Why is this different? Spending time and embedding ourselves in these communities and actually bringing to the forefront to them that this is valuable, what you are doing is valuable, and letting them speak to the value to the folks who don't do it.
Can I interject there, Tavika, just to
say
that?
Can we come right back to you, Marjan, just because there are a bunch of comments. I want to just read through them because they've been sitting there for a while.
It's just a quick point on farming. It's just a quick point. Yeah, actually in New Providence, in my previous job, I actually found that I worked in a place that dealt with like loans for small businesses, and found that there are a lot of actual farmers in the capital that were trying to get support. And the issue was
not that they didn't want to do the work. They actually did a lot of good work in their communities. It was just they didn't have the support. That was all. And they couldn't afford to get loans.
Oh, okay. So they didn't have like the resources to get out.
Right.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So from the chat, we have talking about the Amazon burning. Young people have to be involved so they will mitigate the impact. I think there's a lot of pressure on young people though. Like young people still change the world.
Yes.
I think we need to shift that. Jump in, Ashley.
No, sorry, just that in particular, like, oh, young people will fix it. I'm like, but
we're
involved in making this. So I think that there is a lot of talk about how, like, particularly with youth, there is a big influence. Youth have a big influence on their parents, which you would think it does go both ways. So there have been studies that have shown that, you know, engaging teens and youth in climate conversations can actually change their parents' attitudes. But I am also really bristly about the idea of it's all the kids' problems, because that's ultimately what happened to a lot of us here who are younger on this call. Like, I mean, that was the mentality of like, oh, it's, you know, like this is the one thing that like baffles me sometimes, that like when I was in preschool, one of my friends' moms gave me a book on protecting the environment. And I was like 4. And that was a conversation then. And like, we still haven't fixed it, you know? And so I think that like, just this mentality, oh, teach the kids, they'll make it better, is like, I think that's a bit of it's flawed. I think that there's definitely like, we need to be informing kids and teaching them and giving them hope and giving them the tools to actually do stuff. But I think just we're passing the buck along, right?
We're still operating within the same environment, within the same systems, and we're expected to like work magic because.
And I think that Nikita's model is something that is incredibly useful, because what you're trying to give, I don't think that the goal is to educate and brainwash people, right? The goal is to give people opportunity. And so what Nikita is doing, what Brief, for example, has been doing through, oh Lord, I can't remember what it's called, but essentially they have this gap program. So when you finish high school, if you don't know exactly what you want to do, it doesn't matter, right? You do an internship with one of the organizations that's doing environmental work. And it doesn't have to be focused on science per se. It could be education, communications. And we've seen a lot of, I'm so encouraged by how many young Bahamians, and I include myself in that, right? Because I'm not that much older, right? But there is a 12, 13-year gap between me and some of the people that I'm seeing. And I'm like, these programs are having a difference, right? BNT, we have Krista Sherman, Dr. Krista Sherman, who I remember from when I was in college. I came home, Ashley, when we were doing the fisheries, Ashley and I did a fisheries internship when we were both in college, when we were home for summer. And Krista Sherman has literally taken NASA grouper research and gotten her PhD. She used to work at BNT. She's worked in other avenues. And she's actively doing research and contributing to policy development. And we have leadership in women. This is one thing that I wanted to highlight on this, because we have incredible representation of women in our environmental field. In the BNT alone, all of our directors, except everyone knows Eric Carey, but all of our directors are women. And so you have Shelley Cant Woodside.
Can you tell us their names?
Yes, I'm going to right now. Shelley Cant Woodside, who is, I think, on this call. She is she has degrees in science. She's our science director. We have Portia Sweeting, who is an environmental educator and phenomenal at what she does. Dominique Martin, development professionals, leading fundraising for the organization. Merciful. Katirian, a new CFO, right? We have leaders. I'm missing somebody. Lakeisha, oh my gosh. Lakeisha Anderson Roll, who was my supervisor before I switched roles. But I mean, Lakeisha almost, not single-handedly, but literally helped to bring the funding that we're going to bring millions of dollars into national parks over the next 5 years. And she helped facilitate that process. Some of these grants, you have to get a grant to write the grant. they have to give you $50,000 to help you develop the grant to get several $1 million, right? So we have people that know how to do this, right? Rochelle Newbold, who is the director of the Department of Environmental Protection and Planning. These are things to celebrate. Eleanor Phillips, a TNC, Shara Moss, who is a consultant and works with Stacey Moultrie a lot. Stacey Moultrie, environmental policy. Adele Thomas, who is a PhD, leading climate science in the Bahamas and representing us at IPCC. We have really qualified, and a lot of these people, some of them don't have higher level degrees. And even, you know, I've seen some of these people evolve over my time, and I've only been back, 7 years. So that's the things that we need to highlight, because one of the things too is giving people something to look at and say, okay, I can do that. And you don't have to be a scientist to work in this field. If you care about the environment, you can work in communications, you could work in fundraising, you can work in graphic design. So you don't have to be a scientist, but if you care about these things, you can be involved. And I think that's the thing that keeps me hopeful, because I can tell you an environmental science degree will crush your spirit, because all it tells you is how we're destroying everything. But the people that I work with give me a lot of hope. I would encourage us, there's a book that just was published, a number of Bahamian authors, including Stacey Moultrie and Adele Thomas, and a geographer, Neil Seeley. And it's on conservation, tourism, development, I can't remember the name, but those words are all in there, but it's all about sustainable development and our tourism model and things like that. And climate change is a big part of that.
If you find a link, you can drop it in the
I will. It's available, I think, on Amazon, but it's really great stuff coming out. And we have good people to be using as resources as we have these discussions too.
Awesome. I'm going to run through some more of these comments. We're running low on time. Shelly said it depends on the model you're using to make predictions. I think that was about the 4 degrees, 1.5 degrees thing. Marjan, there are different scenarios that further explain what Shelly is saying. So there's a link there if you're in the chat. If not, we'll post it on Facebook in a bit. Another link on the 1.5 degrees Celsius special report. Dominic says he'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts on corporate efforts versus individual efforts regarding effectiveness. So we'll come back to that. And then there's some little chats. Dominic also says it's hard to believe the government is suddenly taking climate change seriously and will put an independent body in place for real change. It's hard to believe a lot of things with the government, not gonna lie.
Oh,
Elijah sounds, go on.
Check out I could put a bunch of links in here, but the new BEST commission, the BEST commission is now the Department of Environmental Protection and Planning. They have an app where, because what they're basically is, they're like the EPA for the Bahamas now. And that's what they were doing before, but now you can use an app to report, if you see a mangrove being destroyed, it's supposed to have a permit. You can't, there's certain types of development that are already prohibited, right? And put us at greater risk if you have unregulated, and because it is a lot of the large scale stuff, but we do it too without realizing. When we impact the coast, we make ourselves more vulnerable, even in that small area. So you can report infractions or violations of environmental matters to their app. And then they have a lot of resources about the projects that are currently going on in country, because they basically are the coordinating body for any international funds that are coming in, whether it's going to BRIEF or BNT or whoever. So they're a good resource, and they've I think revamped their website a little bit.
Cool. Yeah, Elijah was saying, sounds like the good old what's in it for me approach. Human life and quality of life is the most precious to everyone. For everyone, how I survive day to day precedes caring about the environment and how to be sustainable. So yeah, I think that was linking back to the earlier conversation about why does this matter now? Why does this matter to me? And how, capacity to care and to actually take action. I'm going to ask Charles to chime in here if you still want to ask your question, Charles, while I sift through the comments to see if there's anything else to read aloud. All the links, I'll put them on Facebook.
Sure. I am aware that time is running out. I just wanted to know. I heard some really good names being called in terms of women being involved in climate action in the Bahamas. And I'm wondering what can we as a community do to see more women being involved in addressing climate change in our country, and how can we work to mainstream gender into like climate change and disaster response. Mainly, I'm thinking about this. I was going through my phone today, and it was a year ago that I found myself flying back to the Bahamas with suitcases full of pads, thinking about the response for Hurricane Dorian. So I'm just trying to think, what can we do to ensure that women and gender isn't left out in trying to address climate action? And that's for anybody on the panel.
Thanks, Charles. Anybody want to jump in on that?
You're muted, Nikita.
Sorry about that.
Oh,
is that Tamika? No, Tamika, you jump in first.
No, that wasn't me.
Oh.
Please go ahead.
Okay. That's a really important question, Charles, and I really appreciate you bringing it up. And I think this is where we have to go back to the basic needs and the needs in the moment for people in our communities. Because I believe so many, especially women, we have a lot of single mothers and a lot of single women in our country. And there are, what is exciting, I think, and what's interesting about, I think, the conservation field in general, there are a number of women in that space. What's really fun about being in the conservation space in the Bahamas is that it's a very diverse space from like a racial profile. But when you move into an international space, that changes really quickly. It becomes a very dominant white place. And I think what's really important, and this goes, I think, for everything, is that all of us need to be developing self-awareness. I believe we have to become really conscious of how we are showing up in the world, how our actions, our presence, whether we have a dominant voice or not, and how that may impact another person that we're sharing space with. If we are a dominant personality or a dominant group, whether you're a white man or maybe you're a Black woman with multiple degrees, you may have greater privilege in some cases than other people. And I think a big part of this conversation right now is that we really have to ensure, how are we creating spaces for people to ensure that there's a diversity of perspectives. And this is where I really want to encourage these cross-generational communications, because often when we have these conversations, especially if it's in a forum like this, I believe that the age range it's limited. Maybe, you're like 20 to, I don't know, 50, about that, but we have to be talking to, the elders in our community, and we have to be talking to the youth, and we can't just have a youth panel, but we need to be doing it together. And I think this is where moving forward, we have to be a lot more intentional about how we have these conversations, the spaces where we have them, and really where we go from them. Like, we're having this conversation today, and that's awesome. And what is our action out of this? Because it's very easy, especially when all of us are, you go back to your world and the moment that you're living in, and trying to get through the day, whatever that looks like for you. And I believe there's this balance that needs to be found between making sure that all of us, and especially for women, I think it's so important that we are taking care of ourselves, that we are ensuring that we're getting the energy, that we're getting the rest, that we have the capacity to continue doing this work, because this work, this social justice work, this climate justice, climate change, conservation is emotionally taxing, mentally draining, and you can't share your gifts with the world that the world so desperately needs if you're not taking care of yourself. And I've really come to believe as within, so without, how we take care of ourselves and how we heal ourselves and nurture ourselves is really reflective of how we engage with the world. And so I don't know if that 100% really answered your question, Charles, but what I do want to say is that I believe, though, in the Bahamas, there is a need for us to engage greater diversity and also men in this conversation, and, stepping outside of those who have degrees and going into our communities and, especially some of these marginalized communities, because until these conversations are commonplace conversations throughout the Bahamas, we're not going to see this progression that we need to see. And this means, how do you get with, like, how do we become more intentional about having these conversations? And that means they have to be relevant. And often, I think sometimes when we come from our science brains, we like to show numbers and like graphs and things, but in our society, sometimes numbers aren't going to emotionally evoke someone. So we have to be able to tap into those emotions. And that's where I think love, care, and compassion is extremely important, because we are all dealing with the climate crisis and everything else that life throws on us, And so it's about finding that balance of working with the now and also being very intentional about how we chart our course moving forward. And I believe that needs to be strategic. And I said this in a talk that the Office of the Prime Minister hosted the other day. I firmly believe it's going to be the private sector and the civil society that's going to set the pace and is going to really drive the climate action that we need to see in the country. I believe the government, there are strides being made in the government. I don't think it's nearly as ambitious as it needs to be. I think there's a lot of conflict that exists between approaches to development and priorities, or things that are not a priority, which I would say education. While I agree this administration has made some strides, the access to the university is a huge success. And also there is so much that we need to do. And so meeting these core basic needs. And I think this is where we really need to focus, is how can we ensure that we are lifting the standard for the most vulnerable in our community, while we are also moving forward to focusing on these longer range issues.
And I would like to add that I completely agree. I think that I like to use the term empathy, because I think that it's a skill that we can develop. I think that we can choose to practice trying to put ourselves in other people's perspective. Just because your experience is one thing does not mean that you cannot stop and listen to what someone else's experience is. And it also, I think, in terms of what women, we have to be careful about, because yes, this is a difficult, because our work feels like service. It feels like, sometimes it feels like sacrifice, because you're under-resourced, right? And so you're trying to put all these hours. And I think one of the most effective things that we can think about as individuals and for organizations, whether it's civil, government or whatnot, we have to be very realistic about our capacity, right? And we need to set very clear boundaries. And if we can admit, okay, this is within the scope of what I can do, and now I need to be listening to other people because I need other people's help. And that applies at a personal level, individual level. It applies at an organizational level, where we have to work together, because the issue is that we're not agreeing, right? It's that, okay, I'm thinking about the environmental component, and then someone's thinking about this component, and we need to make sure that when we plan, they all come together and intersect and overlap, so that, because one is going to feed into one, the other one's going to feed into the other. And so, and I think we've started that, and I think we need to be more ambitious, and we need to somehow, and when I think about communities being engaged, we have the power, and we've demonstrated that even in the last 6 months, we have the ability to pressure and advocate for the things that we want. And that's the role that I see, that in terms of engagement, not that people who don't have, you know, if they're fighting to get a meal, I'm not saying that they need to go out and educate themselves about certain things, but they can scream from the top of their lungs, like, we need this. And that's how things get incorporated. It's a part of the process, right? And we as those that are thinking about planning at the higher level need to make sure, yes, that we are actually listening, and that we are creating opportunity and ways for real engagement. And a lot of that has happened, and a lot of Bahamians working in communities, we aren't starting from scratch. And so we need to be very hopeful and really just, we need to put in the work, you know, and work together, because that's when we're going to be the most effective, for sure.
Thank you. So we are at 8:03 or 8:05, depending on which device, I believe. But I just want to thank all of you for being here. Tamika Galanis, Ashley Miller, Fallon Cartwright, and Nikita Shield-Roll, and sharing so much of your expertise and your thoughts and ideas, and being willing to be challenged and questioned in the space. It's kind of always really interesting to be stretched in this kind of way. For me, I think I got some clarity around certain things, but I definitely have a lot of questions that I want to explore some more and think about what we could be doing better. Definitely one of the things that came up is being able to engage people and meet people where they are, and making the connections between some of these sort of like big abstract ideas with people's actual lived experiences, and really adjusting, I guess, our expectations of people, organizations, governments, all these different things. And I guess being able to centralize information a little bit more, because I think that there were a lot of things that were thrown out there, books and pieces of legislation, programs that are being run that a lot of people just aren't aware of. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of just publicizing some of these things. And I think that in itself will help people to make more connections between themselves and the environment and climate. If we were able to, and we had more time and money and whatever else it takes to be able to spend time in parks, right? Like talking about climate, we didn't get to this, but one of the things that I think about a lot is a lot of children going through school and not learning how to swim, right? So like, how do we fill some of these gaps? So like I said, lots of questions swirling, lots of things to keep thinking about and exploring. And I encourage everybody, I think that talking about things like this could be sort of deflating, but Fallon kept talking about hope. And I think to keep in mind that what we have is an opportunity, like every challenge is an opportunity for us to start thinking about solutions, thinking about what we want to see happen. And we might not be able to do all those things ourselves, but we can talk to people who can do it and figure out how to make it happen. So don't let it just sit here. I'll see what we can do on the Equality Bahamas side to move this forward. Of course, we will be focused on women, girls, LGBT people, migrant people, and people experiencing poverty. That's sort of our group that we focus on the most, thinking about them and how to serve them best, not necessarily put more work on them, but to serve them and to include them more in the work that's going on, the programs that are available, and the services that are being offered by organizations and people and programs that already exist. So thank you all for being here. The next Women's Wednesdays will be on October 7th. It's always 6 to 8. It will again be on Zoom and streamed on Facebook so that we don't get into the whole breaking social distance stuff. For the foreseeable future, I think we'll be doing it on Zoom. So look out on Facebook for the link to sign up and for the theme and all that kind of stuff. We should have that out in the next 2 weeks. Thanks for joining and have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you
Good
for having us.
everybody.
Yeah, likewise. Bye, guys.
Bye.